So welcome to this video where I will quickly show you a few tips to get you started with presenting the class data on our lab tree, assets, bases, and buffers. So you should have been able to open the class dataset from the question 5. There, look at the 3 little dots next to the Excel file. And when you click on those, you can download the dataset. The dataset will look very much like this one that I have here on my screen. And I have simply zoomed in a little bit to make it easier for us to watch it. So what you'll notice here is that all of the 6 samples are listed on our first column. And on our rows, you will see the number of drops of either assets or bases that we have added to the sample. And finally, you'll be able to see the pH of each sample with each different number of drops. So to generate a graph, I'm going to choose all the data that I want to illustrate and the number of drops, but I'm going to not select the first row. And I'm also going to include all of the sample names that I want to illustrate. Then I go to the tab labeled as Insert, click on that, and from the charts, I see multiple different kinds of scatter plots. I think that a scatter plot where we have individual values and trend lines shown would be a good choice for this. Your graph might immediately appear like this, or it might appear as something like this. Well, of course, this second graph is not looking like it's going to serve much of a purpose for what we're wanting to see. So if this is what you're seeing, you want to right-click on your graph, go to the Select Data section, and flip the rows and columns the other way around. So you should end up with a graph that looks something like this. What we want to do next, we of course want to give the title for our graphs. We also want to pay a little bit of attention to the numbers that we have as labels for each axis. Firstly, I'm going to choose the x-axis, which is supposed to show us the number of drops added. And you'll notice that it runs to 35, and that doesn't really make sense to me since the maximum number of drops that we could add was 30. So let's fix that. Once you click on the numbers and that area becomes activated, you'll notice on the right side of your screen, Format Axis window has opened. I'm going to go to the 3 bars where it says Axis Options and look at the information there. The minimum number, which is 0, makes sense since we could have samples, and each of these samples were in this case that where we had not added any drops of assets yet. However, the maximum number, I'm going to change it to 30 because I think that makes more sense. For the increments, you see that Excel automatically proposes increments of 5, and that makes perfect sense as this is how we added the drops of assets. One thing that I want to add to this diagram is the label for this axis. So I'm going to go to the left upper corner of the screen where you can see Add Chart Element button. If you're not seeing this, make sure that you have clicked on the graph and then chosen Chart Design tab. I'm going to choose Axis Titles, and I'm going to do it for the primary horizontal as the first one. And you are free to use your own terms, your own phrasing of what you want to tell here. So I'm going to use that as a label. Now the next one that I want to pay attention is going to be our y-axis. So this was the pH that we were measuring. And again, I click on these numbers, and from the right side of the screen, I'm able to choose the axis options as these 3 little bars. From there, I see that the minimum can be 0. That makes sense. And I'm going to make the maximum as the maximum pH value that we can see, which is going to be 14. The reason why I do this, and why it might seem initially a little weird since we don't have values that are that high, is that we're going to actually produce 2 graphs. And we're going to produce one for the bases in a few moments' time. And I predict that those base values will be higher than what we're seeing here. So I want to make sure that our graphs have similar scale so we can compare them with ease. This is just being good practice. And at this point, I want to give you heads up what can sometimes happen with Excel. So now I've chosen as the maximum 14. But look what happens when I click somewhere else. Excel automatically tries to help you, and in this case it quite doesn't help us the way we want. So it proposes that the minimum value for our y-axis would be -1. And of course we can't have a pH value of -1. So I'm just going to change that back to 0. That looks better. However, I'm not quite comfortable with the number of units that we're seeing there. I want to change the increment. Let's put it, for example, to 2. That looks a little better. We're seeing a lot of the information that I want to see. However, you remember I also want to include axis title for this one. So this time primary vertical. And this is of course going to be our pH value of the sample. So this graph looks quite nice. However, I think we can do even better. Well, first of all, I'm going to make the graph a little bit bigger so I'm able to separate these lines from each other, but it still looks pretty packed for me. Well, there's many ways how you can edit the graphs here on Excel. One way is to choose these quick layout options, and you'll see quite a few nice different layouts without having to do all the work for yourself, and you can choose what pleases your eye. However, make sure that all of the elements that we're wanting to see are still included. I also advise you to stay away from including too much data on graphs when it's not necessary. We want to keep these nice and clean for us to look at. So I think I'm going to go with this one here. And you'll notice all that I did was to move my sample legend here to the right side of the graph. We still have nice separation between the different lines that we're seeing. So this seems quite good for our graph here. And I'm going to keep it this way, but I do want to show you in case at some point you want to be a little bit more artistic. You're able to get a lot of chart styles that have been made already for you from the Excel itself. You can choose what pleases your eye and what makes sense in terms of presenting the data. And as I said, there's a lot of these on option already to start with. But I'm going to keep this as simple as I can. So I'm going to stick with this first one. So now, to make a little bit more room for us to work, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And I'm going to move my graph here. And what I'm going to do, because I'm all about using the work that we have already done, we want to generate a similar graph for bases. And we don't want to go through all of those steps that we took to generate this first graph. So I'm going to right-click on my assets graph and then choose copy. And then I'm gonna paste this graph. Well, you say that I have two similar graphs. What the good is with that? That's not what I really wanted to achieve. Well, hold on a second, we'll get there. So first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna change the heading because it's easy to get confused while you're working on graphs. And I'll also notice that I have something to change here. However, these numbers are not correct that we're seeing here. So what I'm going to do to rectify this is that I'm going to click on this graph, and you'll see that automatically Excel shows us the area where the number values are from and from where different axes are included and different data sets. So because I want to look at bases, I'm going to go to the dataset box, which is this light blue, and right to the edge of it. Once I make it to the right to the edge of it, you'll notice that the cursor changes to 4 different arrows. And I'm going to click on that and drag it over the data that I really want to illustrate. You'll notice that the number of drops moves with this selection, but the sample types remain as before. And this is going to be useful for us as we're going to have something that we can compare from one table to another. So let's see what happens when we do this choice. There we have our data for the bases. And this looks very good. Already now we can see a lot of information from these graphs. So just to talk us through that, I want to show you a little bit how we can read these graphs. But first, let's start with our distilled water. And you remember our distilled water was our control, our baseline, that was not including any of the substances that we thought that might make good buffers. So this is what happens simply when you add drops of either acids or bases to your distilled water. Sometimes you might end up in a situation where you have to present a graph, and on that graph you are not able to use colors, for example, because of how it's going to be printed. Well, if on Excel you click on that line, you'll find that you're able to, in addition to choosing different colors, also change the weights and change the dashes of the graph. So sometimes this might help you in a black and white version to separate the graphs and different lines in these graphs. So I'm just going to do this for the sake of continuity on both of my graphs. I think that it makes sense for the distilled water, which was our control, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to do it for all other materials that we're studying. You're free to change the colors, you're free to change the presentation method to what makes most sense for you. And really, the last step at this point when we have our beautiful graphs is that I asked you to upload these on our BlackBoard as picture files. So I'm going to go on top of a chart and then right-click on that. And from this menu that I have here, you can see that I have an option, Save as Picture. And I'm going to choose that. And I think that I asked you to save it as JPEG, but other formats are also fine as long as they show up on BlackBoard. And you'll be able to see that quite easily yourself. So I give a name to the graph and save it. I already had the similar graph there, so I just simply overwrote that file. And I'm going to do the very same thing for the second graph of the basis. Again, I'm finding it from where I want to save it and putting a name, and I have now saved both of these graphs. Now, when you go back to the Blackboard, you'll notice that at the bottom of the question 5, there is a little text box where you can type in your answer. Well, when you click on it, it will open up a set of different options on a menu at the top of that box. And from there, you want to choose the paperclip symbol. Using that paperclip, you're able to upload files from your local computer, and you would go and locate where you saved these files and upload both of them as your submission for this activity. I hope that this helps you with getting started with presenting the data on this lab. Before I finish, I just quickly want to walk you through showing what we can read from this graph. So you'll notice that, for example, cornstarch and sand are not good buffers at all. Their pH changes almost similarly as our distilled water, which was our control. So they're not really doing a good job at all on controlling the pH, not with acids and not with bases. However, what would make a really good buffer would be our baking soda. You notice that regardless of the number of acid drops or base drops that we add, it maintains the pH of the sample fairly similar, no matter the amount of acid or base. Another one that's fairly good is going to be our yeast. However, you'll notice that we're working with a little bit lower pH values. But again, the changes are not very dramatic with the acids or bases being added to the sample. So that's it for this video. I hope that you have enjoyed this lab, and I thank you for joining me.